When Carl came up to the desk, I assumed this was just another middle-of-the-night BS session. He had been stalking around the hospital most of the afternoon, looking for something, but not saying a lot. The fact that he had a couple of the other security guys with him should have tipped me off, but I was a little busy myself that afternoon. We'd had a doctor quit suddenly, and they'd asked me to fix the schedule as I moved the hospitalist schedule around to cover. It sounds pretty important, but my supervisor had done all the work, and I was just reporting the news and changing the spreadsheet around. So far, I'd been cussed at by 3 doctors, had a 4th tell me that they weren't going to show up for their assigned rounds, not my problem, and had another agree, but say that they should have been consulted first. After that, I'd had to call in Team A, the on-call surgical team, for an emergency surgery, something that had taken far longer than it should have. It's amazing how people are happy to cash their overtime checks, but they'll dog cuss you on the phone when you call them in to earn it. Of the 6, I got 5, and the 6th was another case of none of my business. I'd called and left messages, and if they got fired over it, then hey, that had nothing to do with me. It was about 1 a.m., and I was settling in for some YouTube drama with a favorite channel of mine, when Carl came slowly to the desk. The look he had was speculative, but a little worried that he might be on that list of people who were about to lose their jobs. "What's on your mind, Carl?" I asked, when he didn't come right out and say it, instead leaning on the counter like a bird on a wire. "I need to know if you saw somebody come in and leave today, at least since you've been here." My desk was near a major entrance, so my seeing someone wouldn't be outside the realm of possibilities. "Sure, who was it?" "A bald guy, light red scrubs, wearing black leather sandals. He was clean-shaven, and his eyes are the clearest blue I've ever seen." I furrowed my brow, thinking over it, but not needing to think too hard. Red scrubs were not a color assigned with any department that I was familiar with, so somebody in any color of red would have stood out. Sandals would have caught my eye too, since the hospital required all employees to wear closed-toed shoes. The man's description would have definitely stood out, and I shook my head, telling him I hadn't seen anyone like that. "Can you come by the office when you get off?" He didn't seem like he wanted me to, but he needed me to see whatever he was seeing. "Sure," I said, feeling a little weird. "What is it, Carl? Usually you're more than happy to tell me what's going on." He didn't seem to know what he just wanted. "I don't want you to go in with expectations, I guess. I want your opinion without you knowing much about it. After you tell me what you think, I'll tell you what I know. Deal?" I nodded, telling him that sounded fine. I had 5 hours to think it over, and by 6 a.m., when my relief staggered in with a yawn and a fresh Starbucks coffee, my curiosity was piqued. I came down to the ER where Carl had his security office. The office was a cramped little room that held 1 person comfortably and 3 people regularly. How they had gotten those 2 desks inside without building them in there was beyond me, but they took up all the wall space that wasn't the door frame. Even then, you had to turn sideways and shimmy between the edges of the desks, and 2 or 3 more honey buns, and Carl might have to call for the jaws of life some night. The walls were a scrawl of pictures and schedules and memes and random other things, pinned to the 6 huge corkboards that took up 2 walls, the other 2 being plexiglass so the officers on duty could look out into the ER, the epicenter of trouble most nights. One of the desks had an ancient CCTV monitor on it, and that was where I found Carl. "Have a seat," he said, leaning over to open a folder with 5 different videos in it. "What's this about, Carl?" I asked. The last 5 hours had my mind wandering over 100 different scenarios, and I was curious as I had ever been. "Just watch," he told me. "If you recognize the guy, I need to know if he came in, and especially if he left." "Carl, I told you I hadn't—" I know, but I want your honest opinion here. I'm a little freaked out by this guy, and I just want to know what you think of him. I want to know if he's something spooky or not." "I got it then. Carl thought the guy might be a spook or something, and he wanted me to take a look and tell him it wasn't so. He wanted me to laugh and say that, oh, that was old so-and-so from whatever department, and call him a goose. He wanted to be sure that this wasn't supernatural, that it was a flesh and blood human, and that it was something he could catch. Even if it was flesh and blood, I wasn't sure he would want to catch it. Just take a look, Carl said, and started the video before stepping back. It was a scene from the 3rd floor, and I realized it was where the Code Blue had taken place earlier. Code Blues weren't uncommon, but this one had resulted in a death, and it stood out. It was far from the first time I had called a code on someone who died, but it always kind of sticks with you. I tried to remember which room it had been that I had called it for, and when the guy in the red scrubs came out, I realized he was leaving the exact room I was trying to remember. 312's door was closed, but as the man came out, he pulled the door shut behind him and hurried off down the hall. From the moment I saw the guy, I knew something was off. The scrubs he wore looked hand-stitched, the lines standing out on the fabric like an accusation. His head was smooth-looking, and I thought I saw a little gleam as he walked beneath the lights. His face was equally as smooth, and his facial features looked oddly flat, like stickers someone had put on a doll. The whole appearance looked unnatural, but as his eyes looked up at the camera, I found myself trapped by those orbs as they swam in his face. I hadn't wondered how Carl knew that he had blue eyes until I caught sight of them. The CCTV footage was in black and white, but the man's eyes were crystal blue on the monochrome screen. How? I asked, but I couldn't think of how to end it. I suppose the question was still valid, nonetheless. I don't know, Carl said, but I've crawled over the camera footage and I can't figure out how he came into the room. I can't seem to find out when he came into the hospital, or when he left either. Hell, he never even exits the stairwell. I've checked the camera for every floor it connects to, and the roof. The man goes into the stairwell door and just disappears. I rewound the video, watching the strange man come out again, but his exit seemed as unnatural as he was. It was clear that Carl suspected he had something to do with the Code Blue, but his gait, his appearance, everything about him was so artfully at ease. He wasn't hurrying, wasn't rushing, and seemed to think getting caught was an impossibility. That's not all, though, Carl said, reaching over as he queued up another video. This is from the Code Blue a couple of days ago, the death on the day shift. This one was a different angle. The bubble lens showed the 4 North hallway and the nurses at their station. It was around noon and the food carts were still moving up and down the hall as lunch was being served. The man stepped out, his image blocked by a food cart for half a second, before he walked up the corridor and had a camera. A moment later, all the nurses were scrambling towards the room he'd walked out of, but it seemed weird that none of them had acknowledged him as he came by. Cashmere Hospital was big, but it was still a down-home hospital. Most everybody got a nod or a wave when they saw someone they knew, but no one had looked up to wave or say hey to this guy. It was almost like they hadn't even seen him. You see, Carl said, he came out and then the Code Blue came not long after. So, what, you think he's causing the deaths? I asked, wondering why I was here if Carl suspected that the guy had injected them with something or smothered them with a pillow or something like that. That's just it, Carl said exasperatedly. All the deaths are completely natural. The one today was from a heart attack, and the one on 4 North was a lung infection. The tech didn't report any weird needle marks or anything, and both of the patients were dead when the nurses arrived. That's why I was sort of hoping this was spooky in nature or something. Maybe he's stealing their life force or drinking their blood or something like that, he asked, almost hopefully. I only shrugged. I have no clue, Carl. If he's a vampire, then that would be a first, and I've never seen a ghost hurt people in here. Hell, even Shaky Leg Mary mostly just scares people and lets them hurt themselves. Carl sat back heavily and I could tell he was hoping for an easy explanation. Well, not an easy explanation, I guess, but we had all gotten a little used to the excuse of hospital is spooky whenever weird things happened. The answer here seemed to be that there was a weirdo who showed up and either killed people or stayed with them as they died. Then, how's he getting out without being seen? Carl asked, clinging to hope. Who knows, I said. How did that copy of Carol get out without anyone seeing her? How did David disappear into the stairwell for 3 days? Who's to say this guy isn't stuck in the stairwell too? Who's to say he didn't come from the stairwell in the first place? I really don't know, Carl. Could be something, could be nothing. Carl looked like he wanted to cry, but his face was refusing to open the floodgates. He'd been counting on me to give him an easy answer, and barring that, he knew he was going to have to do some digging. Whether it was a ghost or not, it was still killing patients, and in Cashmere Hospital, the management only took notice when whatever it was threatened them or their revenue. Looks like I got some detective work to do. That was about 2 weeks ago. Carl is no closer to finding the man in the red scrubs than he was when he asked me to come to his office. The rumor around the hospitals are that he doesn't leave his office much these days. The day security reports that they can't use the small space because Carl's in there at all hours, running through security footage. He's pulled records on all the deaths within the last few months and has asked the local police to get an autopsy on the 2 who died recently. He has friends in the sheriff's office, or this request would have likely been met with derision. People come to me with these things, knowing that Carl and I are friends, but I don't have answers for them either. He may not have a lot of answers, but he does have more evidence. I found him on the cameras 2 more times, Carl said, sounding downright gleeful as he leaned against my desk. I'm trying to get permission to access the camera archives so I can go back further. The ones I have access to only go back about 6 months. He's been at 2 other Fatal Code Blues, and when I showed it to a buddy of mine who's a detective, he says that's a definite pattern. I was glad that Carl was making headway, but it appeared that he had done nothing but look for this guy since Monday. The underarms of his uniform were concernedly dark, and some of the stains looked old and smeary. There was a smell about him that led me to believe that he might not have been showering regularly either. That's some solid progress, Carl. Any clue where he's disappearing to? His face fell a little then, but he wouldn't be derailed. No, but I'm not sure he's leaving the hospital at all. We can't find any sign of him leaving the stairwell once he enters, and I think he might be getting onto the roof somehow without triggering the alarm. Someone came in through the front door, but as they caught sight of Carl, they turned and headed for the elevators. I couldn't say I could blame them either. Despite looking like a homeless security guard and smelling like a fast food dumpster, Carl just had this presence now, something he hadn't had on Monday when he decided to do his research. It was hard to pin down, at least it would be for normal people, but he reminded me of the mental patients you sometimes saw walking the halls. He had a manic gleam in his eye, a mania that seemed to have taken hold of him, and I was worried that he might become yet another odd presence for the hospital to use in its strange designs. Watching him go through it was more horrific than any manifestation the hospital had thrown my way yet, made worse because Carl was a friend. Carl, maybe it's best to kick this up the line to the cops. If this guy is killing people, then maybe it's best to let the professionals handle it. Carl looked at me like he didn't quite understand me for a second, some of his sanity trying to claw back up before his obsession took hold again. I gotta get back to it, he said, shuffling off like a lost child. I'll see you later. As he left, I felt dread building in me. Much like Danny Torrance, it was frightening to watch someone you respected transform before your eyes into someone you don't recognize. I would have to watch him closely, lest the hospital claim yet another victim. I didn't start noticing him until Carl started bringing him up. I hadn't seen Carl in a while, no more than the the times he came to give me a break, but he looked worse every time I saw him. He had a small resurgence of sanity when the scarecrows had attacked around New Year's, but he had slipped off again in the subsequent weeks. He didn't come out of his office unless he was forced to. He had talked management into giving him a second officer until 11 o'clock, and he used him to do most of his work while he pored over security footage. He was searching for the orderly with the red scrubs, and it had become something of an obsession for him. He's at the site of most deaths within the hospital, and I want to know why. Management thought he was losing it at first, probably because he spent most of his downtime in the security office and didn't seem to go home for changes of clothes or showers. But the more information he brought to them, the more seriously they took him. So far, he'd been present at 60 of the natural deaths within the hospital, but he could be seen lurking around many of the others as well. When Dr. Shen accidentally perforated the artery of his patient during an emergency surgery, one of the scrub nurses swore she had seen a man in red scrubs near the back of the room. When the gunshot victim had come into the ER last week, the officer who'd come with the victim had captured the man on his lapel cam right before the victim had died of his injuries. Carl had months of footage from the security cameras in the hospital, and he'd captured the man's image hundreds of times. Management was afraid that if someone could link these deaths together, they would bring a lawsuit against the hospital. Carl was afraid that the man might be something spooky. He's always present, always hovering, and it's like he knows they're gonna die. I gotta find him. I gotta stop him if he's the one killing them. I'm the head of security. It's my job to keep these people safe, and I'm failing them. He told me this in the halting patterns of someone on the verge of a mental breakdown one night, and it broke my heart. He'd come to give me a break, and he looked so ragged that I couldn't help but offer to help him. He was so detached from the man that had been seen taking charge on New Year's that it made me scared for him, and when he flopped down in my chair, logging me out so he could pull up the cameras, I felt like if I didn't do something, they'd find him in his office one morning with a bullet in his head. So I started watching cameras too. It wasn't like I could watch them all the time, and I couldn't even watch to the level that he did, since I didn't have that kind of access, but I could provide another set of eyes. When I wasn't working on something, I would randomly cycle through cameras, just trying to get a look, a glimpse of the orderly in the red scrubs. I never caught him on camera, but when I expressed an interest in helping Carl, his face brightened as he spent the next hour telling me more than I wanted to know about this strange person. I don't think he ever leaves the hospital. I see him come out and go into the stairwell more often than not, but I've also seen him come out of broom closets and mezzanine doors, storage closets, and empty patient rooms. I think he may be like the things David talked about when he got trapped in the stairwell, things that aren't quite from here but can travel here. The rest was mostly paranoid ramblings, but I got the feeling that Carl had done a lot of camera watching. The orderly wasn't present for every death, at least not as far as Carl could tell, but he was at a lot of them. Carl thought he might be feeding off the dead somehow, but I wasn't so sure. He was present, yes, but he didn't seem terribly malevolent. He was spooky, to be sure, but I got the idea that his presence was more perfunctory than anything. He moved about like the other nurses did, just one more cog going about his work, and I wondered if he were providing some sort of service to the souls that he saw. Maybe, as the nurses and doctors prolonged life, he was there to ease the pain of death. Either way, I started keeping an eye out for him, but, like so many, it wasn't until I stopped seeking him that I finally found him. Carl came to give me a break at about 11:30. He asked if I'd seen anything, and I shook my head as I admitted I hadn't. He said he'd been watching old tapes, and the guy had been coming here for years. He had linked him to hundreds of deaths, but all the recordings reported them dying of natural causes. Most had been expected to pass, and Carl couldn't figure out why no one had put two and two together before now. I nodded along, but I was honestly a little bored with the mystery at this point. It didn't seem that he would ever find this guy. His whole deal seemed to be keeping one step ahead of us. and as I went to get coffee and stretch my legs, I doubted we would ever get close. I was coming out of the dark cafeteria, the coffee steaming from the styrofoam cup I had, when I caught a sudden glimpse of movement and looked up in time to see someone in scrubs stepping into the stairwell. Someone in a pair of red scrubs and sensible black shoes. I ran, wincing as the coffee spilled over my fingers. I tossed it into the nearest trash can, all my efforts going into not bursting into the stairwell and telling him that I was on his trail. I reached for my cell phone to call Carl, but there wasn't time. If I lost him, I might never get another chance. So I started creeping up the stairs as I listened for the push of a door as it opened. When I heard him enter the third floor, I sped up, going through the metal fire door, only a few seconds behind him. 3 South was still buzzing, despite the time, but I had a feeling that he was heading to 3 North. I don't know what I'd call it, a hunch I guess, but I took a left and made my way onto the sleepy long-stay wing. I asked the nurse if she had seen anyone, an orderly, someone go by, but she just shook her head at me without looking up from her phone. I was afraid I might have been duped by my hunch, but when the monitor of the patient room beeped behind her, I saw that someone in room 7 was experiencing something abnormal with their telemetry. The board showed the vitals of the patient hooked up to the machine, and it appeared that Mrs. Hiffrin was experiencing a slow decline in her vitals. It was nothing drastic, certainly not drastic enough to set off alarms right away, but as her blood pressure began to slowly nudge down, I thought I might have found my orderly. I headed for room 7, and as I got close, I heard someone softly singing from behind the door. It was a song that I had never heard before, but it was also strangely familiar. Had my mother hummed something like that when I was young? Maybe my grandmother? I didn't know, but hearing it made me feel a little woozy. Not like it put me to sleep, but it made me want to stand still and listen to the song. In the room, I could hear the machinery starting to blare, the woman's vitals becoming something more alarming, and I shook my head as I focused on what I meant to do. I opened the door in one quick motion, and the humming stopped as the man looked up at me. I mentioned before how flat his face looked, so devoid of character, but I see now that this was a trick. In reality, I can't really tell you what his face looked like. I can't remember it, and it seemed to slide right out of my memory anytime I tried. He was bald, I remember that, but it was weirder than that. It wasn't the usual baldness, but the lack of hair. It was as if no hair had ever grown on this man's head, and his arms were devoid of the usual hair one finds there too. He was smooth, unnaturally so. He looked like someone formed him from fresh clay. His eyes are the only other feature I can tell you about with any clarity. They were crystal blue, the blue of an underground stream that had never seen the light of day, its purity unbroken by any flaw or inadequacy. As we stood staring at each other, him in surprise and me in indignation, I heard the monitor stop yarking as her vitals began to come up again. "I suppose you're the one who's been trying to find me," he said, his voice coming out as a whisper. "One of them, but not the main one. I found you purely by accident." He looked back at the woman, her face a mask of serenity, and looked back to me. "I'm sorry, but I have to do this. It's my job, and my bosses are not the kind of people to be disappointed." I could almost feel sorry for him when he explained it like that, but I realized that might be part of his nature, and shook it off. Can't imagine why your bosses want you to kill people inside a hospital, but it ends now. His forehead dimpled a little, and I realized he was trying to raise an eyebrow that he didn't have. "Kill? Is that what you think I'm doing?" I shrugged, no longer quite so sure. "Isn't it? I mean, people die, and you're seen leaving their room. It isn't a long leap in imagination to assume that you might be killing them." He thought about that, seeming to understand, if not agree with the assessment.
I'm not so much killing them as I'm guiding them, he said,
his words coming slowly as he tried to find the right ones. I snorted. Oh yeah, and Dahmer never ate people, he just repurposed them.
I don't know this Dahmer you're talking about, but this woman I'm here to guide is already dead. Her body may not know it, but its time is up. She needs to rest, and in resting, I will guide her away from all this.
What he was saying didn't make any sense, but it appeared I would be getting a visual. The woman, an old, frail-looking specimen, sat up suddenly. She stretched her spindly arms, the flesh beginning to plump, and I watched her grow young before my eyes. Her hair went from brittle and gray to thick and dark, her wrinkles clearing, and the mouth that had been hanging slack was suddenly full of teeth again. Her bird arms grew substantial, her eyes showed brightly, and when the man offered her a hand, she rose from the bed a new person. It wasn't until then that I noticed the frail old woman still lying in bed, and his statement suddenly made sense. Not a lot, but it made some sense.
"Come along, dear," he said,
and the woman rose beside him.
"Others are waiting for you, people who have been waiting for a long time."
She never said a word, but she went with him. I started to move, but as they passed through me, I felt like I'd been plunged into a frozen lake. I turned and walked up the hall behind them, trying to find words before he disappeared again. "Hey," I finally managed, and he stopped before walking into the stairwell. "I have questions." He pondered that for a moment.
"You may not like the answers."
I shrugged. Never stopped me from asking them. He nodded.
"I have work to do tonight. I will meet you tomorrow night in the cafeteria. Be there at midnight, and I will answer the questions I can answer. At 1 a.m., I will be gone, so don't keep me waiting."
People were yelling behind me, people trundling into the room of the dead woman with crash carts, and in the chaos, he and his charge slipped away. I heard Carl calling a code blue overhead and calling for me to come back to my post so he could respond. I took the stairs, but if they were still there, I never saw them. I didn't tell Carl what I had seen, and he was in too big a hurry to notice anything amiss. Hopefully, after I see the orderly tomorrow night, I'll have something to report. Hopefully Carl doesn't see me on the cameras when he reviews the footage and pooches the whole deal. Till then, guess I'll just have to come up with some questions for this mysterious Red Clad Orderly. It's been a while since I interviewed a spook, and the last one was in too much of a hurry to answer all my pressing questions. This one might be a little chattier than the last. I drummed my fingers on the desk, watching the clock as it ticked closer and closer to time. 11:54, and still no Carl. I was worried maybe he had figured out what I was doing tonight, but I didn't see how. If he'd seen me on the cameras as I confronted the orderly, then he still wouldn't have known about the meeting. The cameras at our facility don't have sound. Most of them don't, and if he had seen me, all he would know was that I had interacted with him. The fact that I hadn't told him would likely make him curious, but I was afraid he'd be angry instead of simply unsure. Carl was on edge most of the time these days, and he seemed always on the verge of a mental breakdown. I checked the clock and blew out through my teeth when I saw that it was 11:58. I had wanted to get there before him, to be sure there wasn't some trap waiting for me, but I suppose he wasn't going to just appear there at midnight. If he was, I wanted to see that too, but I figured he would arrive as he usually did. I was a little nervous about meeting with the mysterious figure, but I had resolved to go. I didn't think he would hurt me. I was no longer sure he was hurting anyone anymore. But you never could tell with things from the spooky side of the tracks. I had written down some questions I wanted to ask him, but most of it would be just stuff off the cuff. The clock on the wall toned. Midnight. Still no Carl. I'd told him I needed to do something at midnight. I'd called to remind him, in fact, but I hadn't liked the way he had sounded when I called him at 9. His whole tone had changed when he picked up, and I didn't like the sound of him when he said that he would be there. I could be overthinking it. My nerves ratcheted up as I prepared with my meeting with the Red Clad Orderly. I heard the scuff of boots and looked up to see Carl coming into the reception area. It was 12:02, so he hadn't kept me waiting too long. "Sorry I'm late," he said, not sounding particularly sorry at all. "Had something I had to take care of." "No problem," I told him, getting up as I signed out so he could have the computer. "I might be a few minutes today, but I'll keep my ears out for code blues." "Yeah, we wouldn't want something like yesterday to happen again," he said, his life sounding a little strained. I laughed too, my own problem sounding just as bad, and as I went to leave, he called my name and I stopped. "You aren't planning to do something I should know about, are you?" My skin prickled a little. There was no way that he could know about my meeting. It had to be a guess or something, but the way he said it made me wonder if I was doing something wrong. Maybe I should tell him what I was going to do. Maybe I should take him with me so he could get the answers he wanted too. I didn't know, but I knew the orderly hadn't killed that woman last night. She had died, but he hadn't been the cause of it. That made me question what Carl claimed to know. I needed answers before I told him what I knew. The only way to get them was to meet with the orderly. "No, Carl, I'm just going on break." He was quiet for a moment, and I glanced at the clock and saw it was pushing towards 12:04. How long would he actually wait? "Okay then, have a good break," he said, turning back to fiddle with the computer. I made my way up the hall before I could second-guess myself. The cafeteria was shadowy, as it usually was after hours, but the lights in the dining room were on in case people wanted somewhere to eat at night. The serving area was dark, the steel gleaming mutely, and it gave me the creeps, as it always did. I scanned the sitting area, almost missing him at first, and when I noticed him sitting in the corner, I jumped a little despite myself. He was sitting in a shadowy alcove, a cup of coffee in front of him, steam gliding up into his face, and when I came in, he looked up and smiled wetly at me. That gave me a whole new shudder, but I tried to hide it as I came in. Like I said last time, I can't really remember what the guy looked like. Anytime I try, my head hurts, and I end up describing the things I can recall. He's pale, he's bald, he's got crystal blue eyes that seem unnaturally bright, and he looks thick through the body. I'm sure he has facial features, but they refuse to stay in my mind for very long. He was sitting in the corner, the shadows gathering around him like a cloak, and it was the hardest thing I'd ever done to take my seat in front of him.
"You're late,"
he said, not bothering to look at the clock. "Sorry, had to wait for my relief to get there." He shrugged.
"It's your time."
We sat in silence for a moment, me trying to figure out what to say before just blurting out the first thing that came to mind. "What are you? How did you come to be here?" He laughed.
"Straight to the point. I like that. The word for what I am is something that your kind cannot understand, but I suppose you would call us guides. We are in all cultures, all civilizations, and we have gone by many names throughout the years. We've existed since the start of humanity, and we will be here when it takes its final, gasping breath."
"What is it that you guide?" I asked, believing I knew the answer, but wanting him to say it.
"Souls," he said, "or what you think of as a soul. When someone's body dies, the soul is released. When this happens, They're often scared or confused. The guides will come to take them to the next stage of life.
I nodded, exactly as I'd thought. Do you act as a guide for all the spirits here?
I try. We usually know when a person will die with some degree of accuracy. Some go sooner, some linger longer. Some are snatched from their bodies so violently that they have a hard time accepting it. I try my best to lead them to the other side, but not all of them go.
I thought about the girl that still jumped from the balcony over by the new wing and nodded again. So the ones who don't go, what happens to them? He smiled, and the effect was very unsettling.
I think you know. You're the one who's been cataloging all the anomalies in this hospital, haven't you?
That surprised me. It seemed everyone knew about my little project. So then, why don't you take the ghosts that are already here? There are so many of them. They're tired and angry and just looking for escape. Why not take them to something better? He shook his smooth head.
You speak as if I haven't tried. The bent lady, the jumping girl, the whispering ghost on the 3rd floor, even the mysterious tapper in the morgue are all spirits I've tried to bring to the hereafter. The angrier they are, the more confused they are, the harder it is to convince them to go. Then, of course, there are other forces at work here, too.
Forces? What other forces? I asked, sitting forward a little. He sipped at his coffee, looking a little unsure of whether or not to continue. What could possibly be here that was scarier than someone who led the dead?
What do you know about the history of this hospital? For that matter, what do you know about the history of this town?
It was my turn to be cagey. I mean, I know about the founding, and I know about the early days of the hospital. He smiled, steepling his fingers, and gave me much too much of his attention.
Did you know, before this was a town of more than a few farms and a dirt road, there was a sanitarium here?
I hadn't. Like a tuberculosis clinic?
Yes. I was the guide responsible for that dreary place, too. The dead were much more willing to come with me when the alternative was staying in those less than peaceful halls. The man who'd bought it thought the woodland scenery and the clean air would be good for people, but very few ever saw much help here. It wasn't the staff's fault. Not really. The land here is blighted, you see. It gets into people's heads and often brings out their darker nature. It's been the site of many terrible things throughout its life, not to mention being in proximity to the prison that sits in those same woods. This is not a nice place, and that energy sometimes shackles people here, makes the barrier between the here and the hereafter very thin.
Are you saying that Cashmere is some kind of supernatural hotspot?
He nodded. And always has been. You sit in the middle of a nexus, though you do not know it. Powerful entities control this place, this whole area, and they likely walk amongst you all every day without you being the wiser. One of them doesn't even know his power yet, and if he ever found out, Cashmere, Stragview, the gardens, this hospital, and your very existence would cease.
I wasn't sure I believed him. This was all a lot to take at face value, but I sensed no lie in him. He believed what he was saying, and that was the scariest part of all.
I fear your time might be growing short, and I really must get back to work. Were there any other pressing matters you wanted to ask?
My head was still reeling, but I remembered one thing I had made sure to write down. The stairwell. What happens in there? Why do you always come out of it, or some other door? He grinned.
The doors. The stairwell has little to do with it, but I do seem to come out of it the most. The doors in this hospital don't always go where they're supposed to go. I think you know that already, though. Sometimes they open onto places beyond the barrier. Sometimes they let things in that would be better kept out. Your friend, the handyman, found this out too, I believe. Others have discovered this as well. Some of them don't come back to tell of it either. The doors are how we get in and out of your world, how I move within the hospital. But we have other ways too. Don't worry.
I glanced at the clock and was shocked to find that it was nearly 1 o'clock. Carl would be furious by now, my breaks usually taking less than a half hour, and I got up and thanked the man for meeting with me.
It was nice to get to talk to someone who hasn't died yet. If your current job ever seems dull, you should look into being a guide yourself. I imagine it's something you'd be quite good at, though the hours are long and the pay is far from good.
We were walking towards the door, me back to my station and he back to whatever work he had to do tonight, when the doors to the cafeteria were suddenly and loudly kicked open. Carl came in, the revolver he wore leading the way, and he told both of us to stop right where we were. I didn't want to believe it, but I knew something was going on. Don't you move a muscle, he said, swinging the barrel at me as I started to try to explain. You two have some questions to answer, and for your sake, you better hope I like the answers. It's not every day that a member of hospital security points a gun at you and accuses you of colluding with a known hospital threat. But very few days at Cashmere Medical are normal. Carl had the two of us in the sights of his service revolver, and the look in his eyes told me that he was not above pulling the trigger on both of us for the good of the hospital. Carl, I said, hand still raised, let's be cool, all right? I wanted to talk to this fella before we just decided he was no good. I did, and I'm convinced that he isn't a threat. If you put the gun down, maybe we can talk about this, and I don't see what we have to talk about. He's clearly gotten to you, and now you're in league with him. It's regrettable, but I can just as easily turn both of you into the police.
You might be about to turn him into the police, the red-clad man said, but you'll find it a little more difficult with me.
Maybe, Carl said, the gun held between the two of us in case he needed to fire quickly. But I've got something special for you. I've seen enough stuff here to know that you shouldn't be able to interact with half the stuff you do, and that means you're physical. Now, I don't know how physical your form is, but I know these here silver bullets I ordered should do for either one of you. The man rolled his eyes.
You humans and your love for silver. Either way, I don't really have time for you to damage my vessel right now. I have business on the 5th floor in about an hour, and it's business that's a little bit important.
Oh, Carl said sarcastically. Gotta get your next victim?
My next job, yes. There's a young lady up there who's in need of someone to guide her when she passes. And if she goes, and there's no one there to let her know what's going on, it's going to go very badly.
I just bet, Carl said, but I don't much feel like letting you kill people in my hospital anymore. So I think you're just gonna have to have a seat till the police get here. Any shenanigans, and I might just, what was it you said? Damage your vessel?
Little man, you are meddling in things you really have no idea of. If that girl passes out of life, she's going to be extremely upset. If someone isn't there to make sure that her transition is smooth, It will make that creature you saw in the OR look like a fluffy bunny by comparison."
"How the hell did you know about that?" Carl said, shooting me a distrustful look.
"Just because you are only recently becoming aware of me doesn't mean I haven't been here right along. I know about the twisted woman, the jumping girl, the phone ghost, all of them. The girl who is getting ready to pass will make all of them look like puddles after a rainstorm. Her anger and sorrow will cause problems unlike anything you have ever seen."
Carl motioned with the gun, clearly wanting us to take a seat. "Of course. Then I suppose you'll just disappear into a stairwell like you always do once the girl is moved on. You can tell your story to the cops, 'cause I don't buy it."
"What you care about doesn't mean a hill of—"
But the orderly had apparently misjudged Carl. Carl was in his element, having finally caught the thing that he'd been seeking, and when he took a step forward, Carl proved his resolve to see him brought to justice. The gun sounded very loud in the quiet cafeteria, and the orderly stumbled back as he clutched his arm. The red scrub top began to turn a dark purple as he bled, the orderly looking shocked that Carl had actually shot him. Carl, someone I had seen shoo bugs out on a piece of paper, didn't look put off by the bleeding man in the least. "Sit down, now. You can just as easily call in a corpse to the police department. I'll tell them you resisted and I feared you had a weapon. There's a mountain of evidence that ties you to a whole slew of murders. No one's going to question me too vigorously about it. Now sit." The orderly took a seat, and I took a seat too once the barrel swiveled back to me. Carl was on the phone, calling the sheriff's department as he tried to get someone who would come to pick up the suspects.
"You okay?"
I whispered side-mouth.
"Yes, but that silver smarts."
"So,
is it really as bad as you say?"
I asked, thinking about the girl on the 5th floor that he'd talked about.
"Oh, most definitely. The kid is the trifecta. She's a 13-year-old girl with an IQ of 198 and a scholarship to a prestigious private school that would open doors for her until she passes comfortably into her golden years. The problem is, she also has cancer, the terminal kind, and it's getting ready to set the sun on her bright future." "What does all that mean exactly?" I asked, not getting it. "What it means is that she's going to have enough fear, anger, and unrequited potential to make a very nasty poltergeist if someone isn't there to ease her in. Probably one strong enough to be seen by normal people."
That didn't sound good. I didn't understand everything he was saying, but the gist was that this girl was going to go off like an A-bomb if she was allowed to die without supervision. This place had enough nasty spooks without something like that roaming free, which meant that the orderly needed to be up there when she passed. I really doubted that Carl was going to have a miraculous change of heart in the next little bit, but maybe I could help with that. Carl was angry with me, that was obvious, but we were still friends deep down. Maybe I could prove to him that the orderly wasn't the threat he thought he was.
"When is this girl set to go?"
I asked.
"In about 30 minutes, the orderly said, looking at the clock. "So, we have to convince him that you have a job to do," I said, looking back at Carl as he hung up the phone and slipped it into his pocket. "Cops should be here soon," he said, not sounding sure of himself, but sounding confident enough. "Carl," I said, and when his bloodshot eyes turned to mine, I knew I had to get through to this semi-crazed friend of mine. "You've got to listen. This orderly isn't here to cause harm. The people he saw before they died were going to die either way. He's here to keep them from piling up in the hospital like the other spooks we've seen. He's a guide to the other side, Carl." Carl snorted. "Sure he is. Best case scenario, he's just a very charismatic serial killer. I guess worst case is he's some kind of vampire or something, though I guess the bullet would have had a harder time hitting him." "Excuse me," the orderly said, sounding indignant. "But what did you call me? I am no mere—" "I swear, Carl, it's the truth. You know I wouldn't lie to you. This is just a misunderstanding." Carl looked unsure for a minute, but the gun barrel never wavered. "You did lie to me, though. You told me you didn't know anything I didn't need to know. You went off to meet this thing, knowing full well I've been looking for him for months. A lie of omission is still a lie, and I don't know if I can trust you now." Carl wasn't wrong, and I had the good grace to feel ashamed of what he'd said. "Then let me show you," I said, suddenly landing on something that might fix this. "How's that?" Carl asked, clearly thinking that was impossible. "Come with us up to the 5th floor. Carl laughed. "Fat chance of that. What, and let you get one more for the road before they ship you off to Stagview?" "No, let me show you that he isn't the one killing them. If the girl dies, and he knows that she's going to die, then you'll know he isn't the one killing them. I give you my word, Carl, that this isn't what you think it is, and this orderly is as much a part of the hospital ecosystem as you and I are. If I'm wrong, then I'll gladly go to the police station with him. You can mark me as an accomplice, even. I'll go on the same bus to Stagview with him, if that's what it takes." I was taking a huge chance here. I didn't really know much about this orderly. Not enough to stake my freedom on, anyway. But if he was what he said he was, then we needed him in this hospital. Worse than they needed me. If this orderly were gone, then the number of angry spirits in the hospital would skyrocket. And while that might be great for my book, it'd be terrible for the facility. Like him or not, we needed him. Carl considered it, clearly not wanting to go along with it, but I think he heard something in my voice. "I don't like this. I don't like this at all. And if I sense you trying anything, I'll shoot you, patients or not," he said to the orderly. "Do I make myself clear?" The bald head dipped forward, then back up only a single time. Carl nodded too and told us to get on with it. We took the elevator, mostly so Carl could hover behind us with his gun trained on the pair of us. I didn't actually think he would shoot us, not in a crowded patient area, but I had little doubt that he could manhandle either of us if it came to it. I'd seen the way he handled the drunks and the abusive spouses who sometimes found their way into the patient areas and waiting rooms. Carl was a big guy, but not all of it was grease. Carl was possessed of a certain amount of working man muscle, and it shone through in times like this. He'd drag both of us down to his office and sit on us until the cops got there, if he needed to. But I got the feeling that they weren't coming as quickly as he wanted. Carl had spoken softly to someone when he'd called, but his facial expressions told me that whoever it was hadn't taken him seriously. As we came to the 5th floor, I felt the nose of his gun poke me in the spine. "Remember, no funny business. I can lock this place down in a matter of seconds. You've seen me do it more than once." That made me wonder who was manning my post, since I was a pretty integral part of that process. Likely it was a security guy that Carl had called in, but who really knew? It could have been Mike or David for all I knew, and I hoped they weren't unknowing pawns in this. Carl was acting very irrationally, but I knew his heart was in the right place. He wanted to protect the hospital. It just sucked being on the wrong side of history like this. As we came onto the floor, the charge nurse nodded at us, but didn't really give us a second look. She knew Carl and I, of course, and anyone in scrubs basically walked around without questions. As we walked towards the back of the ward, I began to feel something. It was like a smell, if you could feel a smell. It was putrid, sickly sweet, like flowers going bad. Carl didn't seem to smell it, but I knew the orderly could sense it too. "Do you smell it?" he asked, side-mouthed. "Smell what?" Carl asked, clearly sensing a trap. "Yeah. Is it—" "It's the girl we're here for. She's going faster than expected. We should have had another 20 minutes at least, but I think she's tipping over early. We need to hurry." He started to reach into his pocket, but when Carl tensed, he stopped. "I need to get something from my pocket, something I use for my work. If you would—" "I wouldn't," Carl said, his voice brooking no argument. The orderly pursed his lips.
Guess we'll have to do this the hard way, he mumbled, and before I could ask him, he began to hum. It was a familiar tune, something I had heard last night when I cornered him, or the night before last, I supposed, since it was after midnight. I saw the nurse at the portable computer yawn and lean down a little. She wasn't alone. A housekeeper slumped against her cart, the towel she was folding slipping to the ground. A tech put his face against his arm and drowsed a little at his computer. Up and down the corridor, people drowsed and dozed, their movements dreamlike and their heads heavy. We, however, seemed immune to this, and Carl looked around with apprehension. Is this how you get away with it? You put everyone to sleep and then you kill your victims? The orderly gave him an exasperated look. If I wanted to kill people, guardsman, it would be all too easy. This is not my calling. It is not why I'm here, and I think you understand that. Or you will, in a moment. We followed the beeping to the end of the hallway and found a room with a young girl and her sleeping mother. The room was awash in flowers and balloons and stuffed toys, all of them wishing the girl a speedy recovery. She was on a ventilator, the machine moving her chest up and down, and it seemed unlikely that she would be getting better anytime soon. I wondered where the cancer was, but I thought it must be in her lungs. How did a child so young get lung cancer? I wondered, but I realized it was probably just a fluke of the genes. A genius with a built-in timer. How horrible. She was likely smart enough to realize that her time was short, too, and not even capable of believing a comfortable lie to ease her into death. I wondered how the orderly was going to take this one, and I figured I would see. The mother, a haggard woman in plain clothes, was asleep in the chair beside her daughter. She looked exhausted, and I supposed this had been a very trying time. She was watching her daughter slowly fade away, and I hoped I would never have to face something so terrible. There had to be no greater pain than burying a child, much less watching them waste away before your very eyes. I couldn't imagine what she was going through, but I supposed it would be over soon. Thank goodness, the orderly said. We got here just in time. She's close. It won't be long now. We would have looked odd standing there watching the girl breathe her last, but I knew that no one would see us. No one had noticed him the last time, and they wouldn't notice him this time either. His song not only put the spirit at ease, but also put the other people on the floor at ease. He was good at what he did, and that was how he had avoided detection all this time. All it had taken was a single nosy security guard to find him, and his operation was put in question. So what exactly is supposed to... Carl started, but as we watched, the girl opened her eyes and looked around. Carl took a step back, not sure if this was part of it or not, but I'd seen it the night before, and it didn't surprise me. Her sallow skin regained the youthful beauty it must have held in life, and as she pulled the tube out of her throat and looked around, she seemed confused, unsure of where she was or what to make of her situation. "Where am I?" she asked, looking at her hands in confusion as if she'd never seen them before. Carl was walking backwards, the gun still pointing at us, as he tried to make for the door. We had closed it on the way in, though, and when he bumped it, he jumped in surprise. Am I better?" she asked, her face slipping from something childish into something more contemplative. No, I couldn't have. Once it progresses to stage 4, the doctor said there wasn't much they could do. Who are you two?" She turned her young old eyes onto the pair of us. "I'm here to take you away from all this. All this pain and uncertainty will be behind you, and you won't have to worry anymore." She looked relieved for half a second, the childish look returning before it was replaced by something colder. "Go? No, I can't go. I have too much to do. I have to get ready for the science fair. I have to write my English paper on Mark Twain. I have to finish my algebra work. I don't have time to go with you. I have too many things to do." "I'm sorry, little one, but those things are beyond you now. You have to come with me so we can take you to the next stage of being. Whatever you have left behind here will have to remain undone. Eternity awaits." He put out his hand, but while he was talking, He seemed to have missed something. She was breathing heavily, panting as if trying to catch her breath, and what she exhaled looked like smoke. It was thick and dark, the clouds wafting from her nostrils like dragon fire, and I put a hand on his shoulder as he offered her his hand. He looked at me strangely until I pointed out the smoke. When he saw it, he drew in breath and his teeth chattered slightly. I know this is a lot to take in, but you must. I can't die. I can't. I have so much ahead of me. I have to graduate high school. I have to graduate college. I have to win a Nobel Prize. I haven't even had my first period yet. I've never kissed a boy. I've never driven a car. I haven't done anything. I'd expected tears, but what I got was anger. I can't die, she bellowed, and the smoke began to billow from her nostrils again. The orderly kept talking, using his calm and reasonable voice, but it seemed to only make her smoke thicker and angrier. I looked at her chart, wanting her name, before stepping up beside him and making my own attempt. Lisa, I said, watching some of the anger dissipate from her. I know you're angry. I know you're a little bit scared, but it's okay. It's scary what comes next, and the unknown is always scary. But if you linger here, you'll spend the rest of your unlife wishing that you'd gone with our friend here. I see the spirits who linger in this place, the spirits who let their business shackle them here, and none of them appear to be happy that they stayed. Don't make the mistake they did. Pass on. Be free. Be free of your sickness, free of your fear and anger. Be happy. She had stopped fuming as I spoke, looking at me before turning to the orderly. Will it hurt? She asked, her face becoming very childlike again. No, the orderly said. It'll be different, but you are beyond pain now, my dear. Come, I'll show you what lies beyond this. When he offered her a hand this time, she took it. Well done, he told me, as he drew her into his arms and cradled her against him. I stand by what I said. You would make a decent guide. He turned to the door, looking down at Carl as he sat shuddering against the door to the girl's room. Are you satisfied, Watchman? I had no hand in the girl's death. I am here to help her move on, not to cut her from the mortal coil. May I pass in peace now? Carl nodded, getting up and opening the door for him. Thank you, said the orderly, and he and the girl passed into the hallway and out of sight. I helped Carl up, telling him he might want to holster his gun as the alarm started going off. We should go, I told him, as we passed the nurses as they came running up the hall to respond to the code. David seemed a little unsure of himself as he called the code blue, and I realized that Carl had indeed drafted him into his covert operation. We got to the elevator, Carl's face looking very red as he tried to process what he had seen. I was a little afraid he might have a heart attack or something, but as we rumbled towards the ground floor, it seemed he was red-faced over something else. I owe you an apology. My God, I pulled my gun on you. I feel so stupid. How could I have thought you were in league with a murderer? I shook my head. It's okay, Carl. I'd have probably thought the same thing if I'd been in your shoes. After that night, the Red Clad Orderly was never pursued again. Carl told the administration that he had made a mistake, and he had overreacted, and he apologized for wasting their time. He went back to something a little more normal. Over time, his demeanor shifted back towards the Carl we had all known for so long, and I was glad to see it. He took about a week off after that, and I suspected that he slept most of it. He came back with much smaller bags under his eyes, and I think it was the first genuine smile I had seen on his mouth in the whole month. I spotted the orderly more often after that, and sometimes he waved at me if we happened to cross paths in the hallway. He's an interesting fella, and I hope to talk more to him in the future. For now, however, I'm content to live my life as a normal receptionist for the strangest hospital in North Georgia.